I've done a couple of DLC playthroughs of Fire Emblem Engage on stream, and both times when Soren came up, a lot of people lamented how bad magic is in Path of Radiance, and how they want to use Soren in that game, but they don't because he's too bad. It makes sense to me that people perceive mages to be worse than usual in Path of Radiance because there are a few unfortunate standout qualities they have. First, they have armor movement in a game where horses are pretty awesome, so it seems like a daunting task to keep your mage up while your paladins are moving 9 spaces per turn and cantoing after every attack. And tome might is also pretty low in this game. While those high move paladins are running around with their high might lances and axes, your mages are stuck on things like a 3 might fire tome or a 7 might el thunder. Oof. Lastly, in a game where a popular strategy is to juggernaut, mages are often perceived as not durable enough to fill that role due to their low defense. I think all of these issues are either solvable or in one case sort of not an issue at all, so let's take a look at Path of Radiance Mages. But first, this video is sponsored by Dofus Touch, the premier mobile strategy RPG MMO set in the same universe as the Wakfu animated Netflix series. Dofus Touch is relaunching globally on April 3rd, bringing its strategic gameplay, 10,000 plus maps, tons of quests, and an updated new player experience that makes the game more accessible than ever before to new English servers. I've been playing the game for the last month, and if you've ever wanted to play a strategy RPG with friends, Dofus Touch is a great game to try. It's truly free to play with no loot boxes or purchasable zones, and offers tons of ways to build characters. My favorite part is the class system where instead of choosing between unexciting options like warriors or sorcerers, there are fresh and original options like the turret-wielding Foggernauts or the whimsical Masqueraders, all of whom are presented in a charming art style influenced by Western cartoons and Japanese animation. If you love tactics gameplay, which I know you do if you're here on this channel, give Dofus Touch a try. The new servers open up on April 3rd, and you'll find a link in the video description where you can download the game. If you use that link and get started on the new English servers before April 10th, you'll get a sweet free shield skin to use on your adventure. There are already 75,000 plus players pre-registered, so there's going to be tons of players to share your adventure with. If you want to learn more, I'll have a longer video coming out in the next few days going into more detail about the game and how it plays, so check that out if you're on the fence. But back to Path of Radiance Mages. I'm going to be talking a lot about Soren here, and that's who you're going to be seeing footage of. And this is because I think Soren is the best mage in Path of Radiance for reasons that I'll get into shortly. But just know that a lot of the arguments also apply to other mages, and I'll touch on the pre-promotes towards the end of the video. Let's start by looking at the common arguments for why mages are bad, and then I'll talk a bit about my playthrough that focused on using Soren as a primary combat unit. First, let's talk about movement. There's no getting around that mages have low movement in Path of Radiance. However, I would argue that this is an issue that is much easier to work around than people think, for a couple reasons. First, Path of Radiance introduced shoving. Your units can stand next to an ally and push them a space forward. One space doesn't sound like much, but one extra space can actually be quite a bit, and you can do it multiple times per turn. Naturally, having to bring units to shove your mage instead of doing combat is a cost, but a pretty small one. Path of Radiance gives you a lot of deployment slots for maps that often require just a few combat units. Everyone else can be deployed for occasional filler combat or utility, so it's really easy to fit a few shove bots into almost every chapter. Mordecai in early joining Laguz even brings Smite, which pushes units 2 spaces, so he's deployed pretty much every chapter for me. The thing about shoving that's really nice for mages is that you can only shove units that aren't much heavier than you. This means a lot of units can't shove heavier units like paladins and flyers, but everyone can shove Soren because he weighs the Fire Emblem equivalent of a sack of feathers. So any foot unit you can deploy can functionally be converted into extra move for Soren, particularly at the beginning of a map. The second thing that's great for moving mages around is how many mounted units FE9 gives you. By chapter 15, you have at least 1 paladin, 4 cavaliers, and 2 flyers. You can't turn all of them into super units, so 3 to 5 of these units have nothing better to do than pick units up and put them down somewhere else. And Soren is happy to benefit from a ride. I actually think this is an area where we tend to be a little unfair to unmounted units in general in games with rescuing. We often talk about how good rescuing is for moving units around, but then also talk about how foot units can't get anywhere. Especially in Path of Radiance, foot units are generally who you're gonna be rescuing. If rescuing is good, it's because it allows us to move slower units around, meaning that if a slower unit can be rescued, they can get places. Obviously, it's still preferable to have a horse or a pair of wings, but between shoving and rescuing, I don't think it's difficult to get mages to important locations on maps, and the cost to do so is fairly small. Every unit can either shove or rescue drop, and Path of Radiance gives you plenty of deployment to work with. All in all, movement is an issue for mages. We would prefer Soren be on a horse with 9 move, but I don't think mage movement is as debilitating as it is sometimes made out to be. The next perceived issue with mages is low might on tomes, and this is the one that I think is basically a non-issue and where we really need to look at the context of the game. Tomes do have low might in Path of Radiance, but enemies also have low res, and lots of our mage options have a good magic stat. Javelins and hand axes also only have 3 more might than a thunder tome, and while there are more powerful one-range lances and axes, let's be real, a ton of your enemy phase sweeping in Path of Radiance with physical units is happening with a hand axe or a javelin. Most enemies have more than 3 less resistance than defense, and for some enemies like tigers or armor knights, the difference is a lot more than 3. For example, a tiger in chapter 23 has 17 defense but 7 res. Even paladins in the same chapter have 5 less res than they do defense. So if you're trying to sweep at 1 to 2 range, magic isn't at a major impediment compared to javelins or hand axes, despite their low might. And even for the occasional enemies that have higher res than defense, like Pegasus Knights and Mages, they tend to be on the squishier side HP-wise, so they still aren't too hard to one-round with a mage. In practice, if you invest in a mage in the same way you would an early combat unit, which is to say giving them EXP and the occasional forge, they can one-round for basically the entire game, barring specific problem enemies like very late-game dragons. Watch some of the footage in the video, you're gonna see a lot of Soren one-rounding things despite low tome might. Of course, in this footage, Soren did receive bonus EXP, but this isn't really strange for an early game combat unit. Soren's damage isn't exciting without bonus experience usage, but neither is any other early game unit. The way we get early combat juggernauts in FE9 is through bonus EXP. All of the physical units that I have regularly one-rounding in the footage, except for Titania and Stefan, also received bonus EXP, or have to deal with a Laguz gauge. There's also one very cool perk we get out of mage combat, and that's Siege Tomes. Path of Radiance actually provides you with quite a few Siege Tomes, provided you steal them off the enemy. Otherwise, you get a couple from chests and character starting inventories. Siege Tomes are awesome because Path of Radiance has a fair amount of kill boss maps, and being able to nuke a boss from 10 spaces away instead of fighting your way to them can be a real time saver and make a map a lot easier. Siege Tomes, along with staff utility if you're diligent about getting some staff uses in while you're leveling your sage, are the other reason I like training a mage. Throwing a bunch of bonus EXP on someone like Oscar or Boyd, I find doesn't open up a ton of new strategies for me, as they don't really answer many questions that can't be answered by Titania or Marcia. But mages do. They can bolting or meteor, and they can rescue with their large magic stat if you take care of their staff rank. So in my eyes, Soren or Ileana are great candidates for bonus EXP. Durability is the last problem for mages, and I think it's the issue that a lot of mages actually don't have a great way around, although there are some options you have, particularly with Soren. So let's look at how my last run went and how Soren performed at different points during it. In this run, I used Soren as a primary combat unit from Chapter 8 for the rest of the playthrough. For some context, I played on hard fixed, and the pace I was playing at was completing all maps within the time frame required for maximum bonus experience, or quicker. Also, I did not allow myself to stay on a map to grind, so if I got to the boss in 6 turns but the bonus XP requirement was 8 turns, I didn't spend 2 extra turns grinding staff rank. So the arguments I'm making are mostly in regards to this sort of run. If you play wildly faster or slower, things might change a bit. We first recruit Soren in Chapter 4, and he absolutely sucks when you get him. He's stuck on a 2 might wind tome, which he's weighed down by, and he has a base magic stat of 6. So forget one-rounding. Soren is chipping for pretty puny amounts of damage at this point in the game. However, Soren joining this early in the game is really good for him even with his rough performance, because the early game of Path of Radiance has lots of opportunities to feed a unit some experience. There's a defend map where we have lots of time to train, and a couple maps like his join map where Titania is able to do all of the heavy lifting, and everyone else can just kind of durdle around and help you grind up your training projects. For me, that project was Soren. I was able to get him to level 5 by Chapter 8. Chapter 8 is where bonus experience becomes available, and I immediately dumped mine into Soren with the goal of promoting him in Chapter 9. Chapter 8 is again a defense map, so it really doesn't matter who gets the bonus experience here. It doesn't change that much about how you play the map. He's pretty good offensively now though, he one-rounds enemies and will continue to do so for the rest of the playthrough without needing additional bonus experience. I promoted him in Chapter 9 and let him take the beach portion of that map and grab the villages. We can start to talk about durability here. With the bonus experience, Soren can take a couple hits and his avoid is pretty good, especially since he can pick up an Ike support for an extra 7 avoid as long as Ike is within 3 spaces of him. This is good enough for him to be tackling combat on maps, and the support is a pretty easy condition to trigger on a lot of maps, and by the time it gets harder, Soren has some other things going for him to make him more durable, which we'll get into later. I'm mostly going to be focusing on combat contributions of Soren in this video, but this early game period is also a fine time to get some staff uses in. Titania is still dominating maps, so it really doesn't cost you much, if any time, for Soren to use the occasional heal staff. And he actually gets more experience from staffing than combat, so you can use Soren for good 1-2 range combat when you need it, and then if you see an opportunity for him to use a staff, it's a good idea for him to do so. We also get Marcia this chapter, and a common argument against a unit like Soren is that we could just bonus EXP up Marcia instead of using him. But we can actually do both. We get a lot of bonus experience, and Marcia can get the next couple chapters worth and a forge and be good enough to do the boss kill on Chapter 12, which is the first map where I really specifically want a flyer that's great at combat. And from there, she's off to the races. So I don't find giving Soren bonus experience stops me from making a really good Marcia. You really get a lot of bonus experience to spend in Path of Radiance. Though I also think that our analysis of units shouldn't end at looking at what a unit does assuming Marcia is used. It's worth looking at how a unit performs when used, even if stronger options exist. So either way you want to look at it, I don't think that we should say all early game units that you could give bonus EXP to are rough because Marcia exists. Of course, we can also spend our bonus experience on someone like Oscar or Boyd, but I don't think they really make better cases than Soren. When looking at who we spend bonus EXP on, we're going to get good combat out of whoever we pick, so the choice is more a matter of what else we get out of the bonus EXP we spend. Out of Oscar, Boyd, and Soren, Boyd is bringing the least unique features to the table. All he's really bringing is combat. Oscar brings a horse, and Soren brings siege tomes and staves. I give the edge to Soren for the bonus experience because we can get a lot of the benefits Oscar provides with his horse, like rescue dropping, without giving him any bonus EXP, and most of our early to mid-game needs for a horse with great combat can be resolved by Titania, and then later Kieran and Marcia can provide good combat with good move. Whereas we don't really get a strong magic replacement unit until much later in the game. Later on in the game, Soren's durability is a bit weirder as it can be more difficult to have Ike within 3 spaces of him sometimes, but it's still usually not too hard to get the Ike support a lot of the time. Especially if Soren is clearing the way to the seize point, Ike needs to be there for that anyway. It's when you want to just throw Soren into a huge group of enemies that can be difficult to get Ike in there, but fortunately he gets another tool to help out his durability in the form of Vantage in Chapter 14. Vantage makes Soren attack first when enemies attack him, which is great for a few reasons. First, there are some particularly low resistance and health enemies that Soren can just kill in one hit. This is a minority of enemies, but it is nice when it happens. Against other enemies, Vantage is good because of how it pairs with Adept, Soren's high dodge rate, and a crit forged tome. Against almost every enemy, as long as he does one of critting, proccing Adept, or dodging, he will kill the enemy without taking any damage. For reference, in Chapter 21, my Soren skill was 28, his avoid was 71, and most enemy hit rates on the map were between 100 and 110. So let's just take 110 and say a random enemy might have a 39% hit rate against him. Cool. Soren also has 28 crit with a Forged Thunder Tome, and most enemies have about 5 crit avoid, so that's around a 23% chance to crit. And finally, Soren has 28 skill, so a 28% chance to proc Adept. So that's about a 21% chance for none of those 3 things to happen and the enemy actually hits Soren. And he can take a couple hits, so if he fights, say, 4 average Chapter 21 enemies on enemy phase, the chance of him dying is under 3%, and if Ike is in his range, he gets 15 more avoid from their B support, so the chance of death would go down to less than 1%. You may have noticed that there are some Soren-specific features in this analysis, namely Adept and Ike support, and these are the main reasons I like Soren a bit more than other mages. He's just a bit more durable if you want to do Vantage shenanigans in addition to him being available earliest. The other mages still bring good offense and siege tomes and rescue to the table, but Adept and Ike support are unique to Soren amongst the mages. I do think that Adept makes Soren the best user of that Vantage Scroll. Most other units don't get that extra 28% chance from Adept to kill the enemy before they counter, and units that do, like Zyhark, lack consistent access to good 1-2 range. Anyway, later in the game is when Soren starts getting access to Siege Tomes as well, which is great because I love having him nuke bosses. Other mages can do this as well, including pre-promoted ones like Khalil, though there are Siege Tomes and a couple bosses to kill with them before Khalil arrives, so you sort of have to decide if you want to invest in a mage and be able to Siege Tome those bosses, or if you'd rather just wait for Khalil. The Rescue Staff also makes its appearance in the late game, and if you've trained Ileana or Soren, they're a pretty good user of it, though you need to make sure you put in the effort to get their staff reps in. Part 3 of Chapter 17 is a great opportunity for this, as the objective is survive for 10 turns, and there are not 10 turns worth of combat to be doing. So you can do something like have your mage help out with combat on the first couple turns, and then spam ward for 4 weapon EXP per use afterwards. Your reward is then a really high magic staffer that can be easily shoved around for big rescue maneuvers later in the game, and who has good combat if they need it. Staff utility is also one of the reasons to use Ileana or Soren over a pre-promote like Khalil. The pre-promoted sages in this game have knives instead of staves, while your mages get to choose knives or staves when they promote. So staves are essentially a reward for building your own sage instead of using the free ones, and the other reward for training your own sage is a higher magic staff. So I think you can get a lot out of mages in Path of Radiance. They do have some limitations, but most of them can be worked around, and they bring pretty valuable utility to the table in the form of Siege Tomes and Rescue Staves, while having good enough combat that investing in them doesn't significantly detract from your early game. I think this makes them a good candidate for bonus experience. At the end of the day though, how good are mages in Path of Radiance? I would argue pretty good but not amazing. Soren and Ileana are B-tier units to me for their availability and early access to bonus EXP, but they aren't better than flying juggernauts like Marcia and Jill, and they are lacking in utility without investment. What I mean by this is when you look at a unit like Oscar, who is solid with bonus experience, he's also great without it. His early game contributions are meaningful, and even if you never give him a drop of EXP afterwards, he can still be deployed to pick units up and put them down elsewhere, and mages aren't like that. Early mages are a project, and if you don't invest much in them, you won't get much out of them. Fortunately, Path of Radiance gives us bonus EXP to shortcut our project units to usefulness, but I think it's good to reward units like Oscar that are good with or without bonus EXP with a higher estimation of their general usefulness. So for that reason, I have mages under the mounted units, but I would argue that they are at the top of the infantry units, maybe just behind Mordecai because being able to shove units 2 spaces while having high weight is really good. The later sages that you get are filler. Khalil comes locked and loaded with a Meteor Tome ready to take out some bosses for you, but Bastion doesn't really have much to do given his late arrival. There's also Tormod, who I haven't talked about yet, and I actually think Tormod is okay, but he doesn't really have a role in most playthroughs. You can bonus EXP him and he'll do okay, but if you were going to bonus EXP a mage up, you probably already did it. Joining later makes it a bit harder to get his staff rank up, but he does come with a C rank in fire, so he can use Meteor as soon as you get your hands on one. But his Thunder is a little sad at E, so bolting is a no-go for a while. In a vacuum, he's not bad, but there just doesn't seem to be much reason to invest in Tormod to me. I wish he came at a higher level, because then maybe we could see him as a lower investment alternative to Soren or Ileana to have a Siege Tome unit before Khalil. But he only joins 1 level higher than Ileana does, so the appeal just isn't really there for me. On the whole, I like mages in FE9. Their biggest downside is that they don't have a horse, but I think they're way more appealing than other infantry units. With other infantry units, it's easy to feel like, why am I investing in someone like Boyd to throw a hand axe when I could be investing in Kieran to throw a hand axe but on a horse? But mages actually do have a niche in 1-2 range combat that hits res, and Siege Tome access, and then rescue staffing, which isn't unique, but is a useful niche they can fill that your Cavs and Pegasus Knights can't. Anyway, this has been my long rant on why I don't care that Wind only has 2 might in Path of Radiance. As always, a big thank you to my geckos on Patreon, and a shout out to my skinks Red Mage Morgan, Chicken, Morgwolf, Upscale Furry Trash, Cosplay Sylveon, Emma, Van West, Aikipoo, Lucy Sev, Romeo, Wingman, Lonely Voxel, Aaron Gedden, Mikabre, Stars to Art, and Doopy. I really appreciate all of your support, and if you want to support the channel and appear in videos like this, you'll find a link to the Patreon in the video description. Thanks for hanging out until the end of the video, and have yourself a lovely week.